afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the main stage. Great to see everybody here at the Breakbulk Americas, again, here in person. And all of you here for this next panel. My name is Dominic Sun, and I'm the Director of Trade Development for Port Houston. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the next panel entitled Standardizing Carbon Emissions Reporting in Breakbulk Industry, Presenting the Plan. This session will effectively close the loop on much of the discussions that took place during the Executive Summit on Tuesday on the same subject. I, along with Steve Spoljarek or Spo, are on one of the panelists on today's panel, are both on the Breakbulk Americas Advisory Board. And we are responsible for reviewing all the proposals for panels, discussions at Breakbulk Americas. I think you will all agree with us that the topic of carbon emissions and carbon emissions reporting is one of the most important topics facing the industry today. And this is why the advisory board felt strongly of putting the panel discussion together for the main stage today. Before we kick off the program, let me introduce the panelists to you. Steven Spoljarek, or Spo, is the Corporate Manager of Global Logistics for Bechtel Corp. In his role, he focuses on the collaborative, integrated engineering logistics approach to increasing predictability of deliveries and improving safety and sustainability in logistics. He was recently appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Transportation to serve on the Maritime Transportation System National Advisory Council. Spo has a Bechtel certification in logistics and has a Six Sigma Champion certification as well. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Fordham University and a master's degree in industrial engineering from Clemson. Spo was selected as Bechtel's Distinguished Technical Specialist, the first for logistics in the company's history. Along with him on the panel today will be Richard Lindstrom, who is the Program Manager, Clean Cargo Smart Freight Center. He has been in the business of maritime sustainability since 2012. Recent 5 years mainly focused on GHG. Educated at Chalmers University of Technology at a shipping and logistics bachelor program with a 1-year emphasis on maritime sustainability, Richard sees part of his role within an industry being to facilitate the creation of tangibility from the wide range of discussions, ambitions, and prospects existing in the field of maritime decarbonization. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Spo to kick off the panel. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks for those of you that are skipping lunch to come listen to this important topic. I know it's not always one of the more popular topics, but it is a very important topic. So today we are going to talk a little bit about what was discussed in the Executive Summit. The intent is that although the Executive Summit was by an invite only, the intent is to not make it exclusive, to make it a very inclusive discussion. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the feedback I think the collective audience in that session gave and things they talked about. And then more importantly, we'd like to talk a little about what are the next steps for this industry. So maybe before we get too deep into the actual session, if you could just talk a little bit about what Smart Freight Center is and what are some of the initiatives that you've been involved with over the last few years.
Sure. So is it the lunch that is making the lack of people? I hope so. Okay. Good. Yeah, so my name is Richard, working for Smart Freight Center. It's headquarters in Netherlands. Me myself is based in my basement in Sweden, so that's a branch of the organization. Smart Freight Center is all about transportation and logistics and the greenhouse gas emissions related to this. It has 10-15 years of history with the core of the activities, or the core of the organization is something called the GLEC framework, which is a framework with multimodal application for how to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions from all modes and all modes of transport, and that has become the main industry standard since quite some years now. And we're also hosting several industry collaborations, and one of the more successful ones is called Clean Cargo, and that's kind of what we would like to maybe, hopefully, we could develop within the breakbulk sector. So Clean Cargo is a container-specific collaboration around greenhouse gas emissions reporting and monitoring and reporting, but also trying to come up with tangible stuff when it comes to decarbonization, because it's a lot of fluffiness in the industry, and I mean often it's good also to admit when there are things you cannot do much about the coming years, and identify the things you actually can work with. So in that sense, we are the opposite to alarmists when it comes to greenhouse gas, the greenhouse gas or the climate issue, I would say. So it doesn't you don't need to be an alarmist to recognize the need to do something, and then should be pragmatic and not any rush, we would say. So Clean Cargo is one major component of Smart Trust Center, together with the GLEC framework on methodology guidance, and then we have several other things we don't need to go into depth now.
Okay, and again, for those that may or may not be familiar, I'll reiterate: the container industry has guidelines today that the carriers, the forwarders, the shippers have adopted. Right? It may not be perfect. It may not be the final. It'll go through evolution just like anything else. But the fact is, they do have a guideline. You guys are working today now with the roll-on, roll-off industry to establish guidelines in that sector. For breakbulk and general cargo that we move, primarily this conference specifically, there's no guideline, none at all. So whether a customer asks me as an EPC, I ask a freight forwarder, or I ask a carrier direct, can they provide me with something in regards to their greenhouse gas emissions? Maybe, right? They know their vessels, they know the fuel they're using, they know the all the details that would be required, the distance they travel from port to port. The information is there. Is it being collected? In most cases, the answer is probably yes. But what is the methodology for how that information is going to be mathematically shared and distributed in a consistent way? So that way, when we collect it, we pass it on, it can stand through an audit, it's trusted, and it's verifiable, right? So as we mentioned earlier in the executive summit, we brought a number of carriers, ocean carriers, freight forwarders. There were a few ports, and we also had a number of shippers there as well. We separated the group into similar sort of entities and had them discuss a couple important questions, right? And as we went through those questions, we would then wanted to see what was the feedback. Did the carriers think the same way on some of these things as the shippers? Did the freight forwarders agree with both? I would normally insert a freight forwarders joke, but I won't do that because we're getting close to the end of the session here. But the reality is there were a few key things that came out of the discussions. The first one emphasized over and over and over again that the guideline has to be fair, right? And we think about fairness in the industry between competitors, right? But the feedback wasn't just between competitors, it was actually for a single carrier within their whole fleet. If they had very heavy lift ships in their fleet, and then maybe they had some additional smaller type ships, should the guidelines apply equally to both, or should there be some sort of an adjustment to the fleet size? So I'll pause there, and I'll come back to get your thoughts. I think, in the container industry, there's obviously a lot more standardization. There's a lot more consistency. What's your initial view on the topic of fairness?
No, I mean it's of course crucial to create the trust and willingness to participate both in the reporting, I mean, in the disclosure of information on the vessel performances, but also maybe to unlock the willingness to maybe do something that you wouldn't have done maybe. Even in an industry like the container side, which is highly standardized, as you know, we do see the numbers, are all over when it comes to greenhouse gas performance of vessels. If you're not sticking to a standard, we have seen, and there was an article some year back on this, that major carriers there was a comparison between similar vessels, similar trade lanes, and those should be very equal to each other, very similar. But the numbers you got from asking various carriers was all over the place. So plus minus 30% or so, and then it's just useless. Then speaking about a less standardized sector as the breakbulk, it becomes even more important, of course. So without a standard, I mean, I would say it's quite hard to work in a structured way around it. Of course, you can reduce emissions without knowing, what you're doing, without claiming it in a credible way. But it will certainly help the industry a lot if you would have a standard. And the fairness, as you mentioned, also that will be the main challenge, to come up with something that feels good and is fair between various types of vessels and cargo.
Yeah, and I think the next sort of theme that came of the feedback was, how will the data be used, right? There was concern that, and I think there was a reference to a stick and a carrot, right? Will the data be used back against the carriers? How will it be used? So some of the discussion circulated around why need for a guideline, right? Do we just ignore and wait until a government regulation applies? And again, I think the feedback consistently across was, there's usually probably three ways today of why a company, whether it's the owner, whether it's the EPC, forwarder, carrier, would want to have a guideline in place, right? And it's typically because of private investment or shareholders, right? They demand that of their company. They want to know what is the footprint of their company and the suppliers they work with. The second is, as I mentioned, a government requirement. It becomes mandatory that you have to do something. Or it becomes a situation where, in order to get one of these big projects financed, it must follow some guideline for reporting on emissions. So basically, the feedback from the group was, why have a guideline, right? Are we just doing this for the heck of it because the container industry is doing it and other industries are doing it? The answer is no. We recognize that within the next few years, those three forces will single-handedly, any one of them will drive the requirement, right? So instead of waiting until the requirement is defined by others and put in a position where we may have difficulty meeting it, it's better that we work as an industry, and the key is as one industry, to come up with a guideline that we can all accept and reference back and forth. One of the other questions that came up that will have to be addressed is that this is really the first conversation that's happening officially within the industry. The recommendation is there will be subsequent industry discussions, hopefully having Smart Freight Center as the neutral party, facilitating those conversations, and then more importantly, really starting to understand some of those key questions that most people would think about. If you haven't thought about, they become quite simple. Things like, if you're on a ship with other shippers, right? How do we distribute the carbon of or the CO2e of that ship across the voyage, right? And assuming that you're even going from the same point to the same point, is it by weight? Is it by volume? Is it weight volume? Is it value? Okay, maybe that's a simpler one to address, but then it gets into the question, what happens if the other cargo owners pay for a last in, first out? They pay for the ship to go faster. Now, because I'm on that ship, do I now take additional responsibility for additional fuel usage, or does that get applied differently? Again, without a guideline that sort of defines those rules, it will be chaos. It'll be very chaotic to go back and audit. It'll be very difficult to share that with confidence. One of the other questions that came up was, when these numbers get reported, and want to see what your view is on having gone through this in the container industry, will the data apply to a company? And again, and that's all of their operations, or will it apply to specific vessels? So I'll pause there and see what your thoughts are, and I'll lean in a little bit on, when most companies evaluate a company's financials, for example, they look very specifically at that company, right? They don't pick and choose across multiple companies. If it's a multinational company, you get one entity to evaluate. So the question really is, among the group, will the data be used to evaluate companies, specific vessels, or both?
Yeah, I mean, I think it somehow ought to be both. Not necessarily, but that's my opinion. And in the container sector, it's quite much the company that is the one responsible for the numbers, and by the logic that where the money goes is what is supposed to be measured, and that's the flow of money will somehow, if there will be a possibility to push in some direction, the flow of money will be crucial there. So for the breakbulk industry, I mean, since individual vessels are important in another way than they might be in the container industry, I would say it's important to have a vessel level reporting, vessel level information to create some kind of benchmarking situation that is meaningful. But in the end, it's a fair view to actually look at the company. What does this company perform on average? In order not to, judge either too good or too bad based on single vessels. So I think the carrier, the company perspective is very important to have there. Also, including the long term, to get some kind of view of what this company is doing in terms of, what might come in 5 years also, in order not to have those people or those companies that might have quite a poor performance now, but are investing in something for better performance in 5 years. This needs to be visible somehow.
All right, great. One of the other things that came out of the session, which again is very important, is where's the start point and where's the finish point, right? So most people would say, okay, it's the ship, okay, but is it from point of rest where the cargo is landed at the port onto the ship? Is it FOB loaded on the ship? What about all the welding to secure the cargo to the ship? Does that go into the overall emissions calculations for that voyage? Again, very different than containers where it's unitized, it's being done in a very similar, consistent way, depending on your cargo profile. So this is the next complex thing. It's not just the specific vessel. Now it's your cargo profile, and even in some cases, how did you use a shore crane, using vessels gear, is it a roll on, roll off? There's a lot of different scenarios within our industry on where this start and finish point would be. Again, reinforcing why this guideline will be so important, so that it's very consistent, that in a bid situation, if you are evaluating, and this is a requirement for your project or for your client, how do you ensure that you're comparing apples to apples? And again, without a consistent guideline that can be referenced, no different than a weld specification. If you're going to go inspect a weld, you need to know what rules did they follow when they made the weld. That should reinforce in a very similar way why this guideline is so important for our industry. The next sort of topic that came up was, at Bechtel, we use something called the 4 Rs. We say we want to record, we want to report, we want to understand regulation, and then we want to reduce, right? And if you think about those, record, report, regulate, reduce, there is a sequence there, right? If you race too much, like you said, tomorrow we could start making efforts to reduce, and we should if they're in front of us and they're available, especially if in the scenario that is also the least cost, right? So if you can reduce and still achieve least cost in your evaluation, it becomes a very simple evaluation, just like on schedule, right? If your schedule is important for your project, you start to look at what the costs are. If the low cost happens to be the best schedule, makes a decision a lot easier. Where it becomes complex is where it's switched, right? Where the least cost now is not the lowest emissions, or vice versa, right? And being able to understand what companies are doing, again, has to follow a guideline, or it's just artificial discussion. So I think one of the key points that came out from this then is, what do the clauses eventually look like, right? Because everything is going to have a contract, right? Wish in many cases we could go back to shaking hands and that would be good enough. But as we all know, having clauses between ourselves as shippers and carriers is quite important if there's a dispute. So there were several discussions on that subject as well. Now, to be clear, the guidelines, and maybe you want to reference similar guidelines for other industries, but the guidelines will not address, kind of like Incoterms, they will not address contractual disputes, right? So if there is a dispute in a contract based on a clause you decided to use, this will not apply at all to that. It will be very specific to say what are the rules of engagement for reporting, and then whoever's receiving that data will understand exactly how the data was derived. So maybe if you want to share some perspective on how regulations and or clauses sometimes should affect or should not affect the guidelines.
I'm not sure if I'm able to answer that question actually, that level of detail right like that. But maybe I would just instead try to point out again, that I think this whole thing from a commercial point of view, it's really important from a commercial point of view to come up with the standard. So again, as mentioned, if numbers are up and down, 30 plus minus 30%, that does something to the market. If greenhouse gas performance is becoming increasingly important for procurement decisions, if it does, or it's already becoming like that, but then it will be crucial to have a standard there to keep the market sane, so to speak. So that might be my only take on that commercial angle at all there.
Okay, so although this is a relatively short session, I'll reiterate for anyone that wasn't here in the beginning, this is a bit of a report out of an executive summary or executive summit that happened 2 days ago with a number of shippers, a number of freight forwarders, and a number of ocean carriers. The intent now is, what do we do next, right? We could talk about it, have more panels about it, and in 2, 3, 4 years, still not have a guideline. So the group is really leaning in. Again, the intent would be to use a company who has experience in doing this for the industry, so that we can quickly advance. So I'll lean back over and say, what are the next steps? What would you recommend from your professional experience in doing this in other industries? What happens next? And are we 2, 3, 4, 5 years away, or are we 6 months away from actually maybe at the next Breakbulk in Europe presenting the guidelines as a proposal?
No, provided that we could get started as planned, get what we need to get started. Our idea is to have this done in 8 months or so, and to be very concrete, we are planning for having a number of gatherings with the industry, where we would like to be quite proactive and create stuff that is quite detailed and put that at the table and then work around those, instead of starting from scratch with the industry, so to speak. And we think with that approach, we will be able to have something done and finalized in hopefully spring, summer next year. But it all depends, of course, on a lot of things. So I mean, it will be quite challenging, but in the end, consistency is more important than the actual details of everything. So if the industry or the people contributing will have the same thoughts there, then we will get somewhere and come up with a final product, I think.
Yeah, and one thing for me personally, and I'll reference this, is that I kind of assumed that it would be a vote, right? We're going to come out, we're all going to raise our hands and say, yep, we agree with this specific guideline, or we don't agree with it. But the feedback that we had was that is not how we would typically do it, right? We will give our feedback as an industry, so that's my opportunity to invite anyone that's here who would like to participate in those discussions, whether you were in the executive summit or not. Please feel free to reach out to us, and when we do schedule future discussions on the subject, happy to pull more people in. The more people that can contribute to that feedback, the better. But the point is, once that feedback is collected, they will go away as professionals and then write the guideline, right? Not everyone may agree exactly with every letter or every word that's in the guideline, but the point is, it will be a standard guideline for the industry to follow. So with that, we'll pause. I think we're out of time. If there's any immediate questions that you guys have now, great. And like I said, I'm sure it's through LinkedIn or here after the show. If anyone wants to reach out, please feel free to do so. Okay, any questions?
Thanks so much, Bo and Ricard. I mean, this is all valuable information, especially, super relevant. What's facing in our industry is standardization for protocols throughout the entire supply chain, not just in emissions reporting, etc. So it's very important for us to focus our attention on standardization for the industry overall as a whole. Does anybody have any further questions for the panel?
We're not as funny as the main keynote. Yeah.
As John Ratzenberger. So if there's not, I want to thank the panel for their time as well. And if you can help me thank them as well, that would be great. And we'll bring up the next panel in about a couple minutes. Thank you.